Hello everyone, my name is Preston, Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call today's episode UFOs and Weird Animal Stories. Yeah, you heard right. Today I want to talk about UFOs and some encounters that involve animals in a little bit of a different way. I mean, there are tons and tons of cases involving animal effects. For example, dogs barking when a UFO shows up, or farm animals acting restless, this sort of thing. But this goes a little bit deeper than that. These are some more of the strange and unique cases that I found, which I think have something interesting to say about the UFO phenomenon. These kinds of cases should really come as no surprise because obviously ETs are interested not only in humans and in plants, but animals of all kinds. I did a previous episode called Alien Zoos, where people have been taken on board and seen all kinds of animals. Certainly I talked quite a bit about that in my book Symmetry, involving Dolly Safran, who saw a lot of this sort of stuff going on firsthand. But what I've collected here are 8 cases which are a little bit more unusual, some quite poignant, some a little bit harrowing or grim even. But definitely I think all of them have something important to contribute to our understanding of UFOs and these ETs visiting our planet. So that's why I wanted to do this episode for you today, and let's just get started. And this first episode I call The Floating Horse. This one actually took place in Cier-de-Riviere, France. It involves one witness who was walking his horse home when something very unusual happened. This case took place on October 16, 1954, and involves a farmer, a 22-year-old farmer by the name of Guy Puyfourcat. He was leading his mare through the fields near his home in Cier-de-Riviere, France, and the horse became frightened and started looking to the right. At this point, Guy heard 3 shrieking sounds coming from the bushes to his right, and according to one report on this case, he saw 3 creatures run into the bushes. Other reports don't mention the creatures, but I put that there because certainly one did, and there are many reports on this case. However, seconds later, according to the witness, he saw a 5-foot wide, gray, kind of round, pan-shaped object rising up from behind these bushes, and it rose 150 feet into the air and then came towards him. So as it passes overhead, it stopped briefly right over Guy and his horse. And at this point, Guy's horse rose up 9 feet into the air, high enough that he could no longer hold on to the reins for fear that he would be pulled up with his horse. This lasted just a few seconds. The craft darted away, at which point the horse dropped back down, fell on its side, and remained motionless for 10 minutes. It then did stand up, but it was covered with sweat and mud, it was trembling with fear, and it stumbled all the way home. Strangely, Guy himself felt absolutely nothing. He felt no sense of weightlessness, no effects at all. So that is strange. So there you go. That's the case of the floating horse. And no, it's not a Pegasus. It didn't have wings. I don't know what's going on in that case, but it seemed almost intentional. I suppose it could have been an accidental byproduct of this UFO hovering so low over the horse, but it didn't affect the horse's owner. So that makes that theory a little bit suspect. Really hard to say, but it's certainly an interesting case. And here's another one, which I call the paralyzed dog. This actually occurred one day later, also in France, more specifically in Corbière, France. And this case kind of touched my heart a little bit because the effect on this dog was really quite traumatic. This case occurred on October 17, 1954, as I said, one day after the above case, and not that far away. I mean, when you consider how the UFOs can fly so quickly. This was in Corbière, France. The main witness is a gentleman, 65 years old, by the name of Maxime Pignatelli. And he was out hunting with his dog along the banks of the Durance River. And he was taking aim at a quail as it flew from a thicket when he saw a black oval object about 12 feet across. This was landed on the ground, not far away. On the top section, he could see a small dome with two small childlike beings wearing helmets. At this point, these two little beings began to exit the craft. Maxime's dog ran towards them, barking, but Maxime himself was shocked and frightened. He actually panicked and ran right into a ditch filled with water, soaking himself up to the neck. Moments later, his dog reappeared, howling and whining in fear, and was dragging its back two legs as though they were paralyzed. He was pretty much convinced that the ETs had done something to his dog, but they didn't say what happened next. All the reports just say that at this point, Maxime left the area with his dog, and as he's walking home, an overwhelming tiredness swept over him. So he felt that this was an unusual effect. Perhaps it was the cause of him being so frightened, but he didn't seem to think so. Certainly his family verified this effect. Thankfully, by all accounts, his dog was all right, so it does have a happy ending in that regard. Yeah, I like that case a lot, even though the poor dog was left partially paralyzed, temporarily, thank heavens. But wow, it's so awesome to see that the dog ran towards this UFO, clearly to protect his owner. But yeah, had quite an interesting effect from approaching these ETs. And here is another case, which honestly I've never heard one quite like this. It's quite grim. I am not sure what to make of it being so unique. But I do think it's important to present, and it does appear to be a legitimate case. It's well investigated. And I call this the sheep slaughtering alien. So yeah, this one does have some sort of difficult, grim elements to it. Just a little warning there. But definitely a very interesting case, to say the least. We don't have the exact date of this next case. This occurred in early 1968 in Otoko, Bolivia. Otoko is a small village near Uyani in southwest Bolivia. We do know the main witness. Her name is Senora Valentina Flores. And it was around 6 p.m. one evening in 1968 when she went to corral her sheep and llamas, which were grazing about in the fields approximately a half mile from her farm. And she had corralled all the sheep, put them up in their little pen there, and then went to get her llamas. And as she's walking her llamas back to her farm, she saw that the sheep pen had this weird, sort of strange plastic netting covering it. And looking inside the pen, she saw a very short male humanoid moving around inside. He was somewhere between 3 and 4 feet tall. He wore a jumpsuit with a backpack and a helmet on his head. Otherwise, he was basically human in appearance. But in his hand, he held a tube-like device with a hook on the end, which he was apparently using to slaughter her sheep. Now, her first thought was this was a sheep rustler and that he was stealing her sheep, so she immediately began throwing rocks at this intruder. But at this point, this entity moved over to a small device which sat on 4 legs on the ground, and it looked to Valentina sort of like a large radio. This entity proceeded to touch a button or a knob on it, at which point the netting over the pen instantly retracted inside of this device. Valentina grabbed a thick stick, which she used for protection, and she ran up to this little guy to stop him. At this point, he turned to her and threw this tubular device, which flew towards her and cut her arm. This device then returned to his hand like a boomerang. Now she tried to approach him, and he threw this thing at her several times. Each time it would swing by her and cut her. Now these were very minor cuts, but this instrument did prevent her from reaching the little man. This figure then grabbed the radio device, and he had a small plastic-looking bag which she believed was filled with the sheep entrails. Suddenly 2 tubes extended from the being's backpack, and he rose up into the air and promptly disappeared. After he was gone, Valentina inspected her sheep pen, and she saw that 34 of her sheep had been killed. So this did create quite a sensation in the local community. Researcher J.J. Benitez heard about the incident. He arrived on the scene, interviewed Valentina, and conducted a thorough investigation. He even talked to the neighbors. Valentina was considered an honest and sincere individual, although not educated. It was clear to Benitez that the injuries from that the sheep had were clearly not done by predators. So it's a really unusual case. This was published in the Flying Saucer Review, and yeah, a very unique case. Yeah, it does seem clear in that case that this was an ET, given its appearance and how it floated around. And although it did sort of respond hostilely to the witness, she was throwing rocks at it, so perhaps it was defending itself. Though that's not really an excuse for the way it came after her sheep. It is what it is. It's a unique case. I don't know of any others quite like it, so I think you might want to consider that. So I don't know. It's an interesting case. And here's another one which is really quite brief, but it fits in perfectly with this theme tonight, and I call this one Goat Kidnapped by ETs. And this one took place in Via Altagracia in the Dominican Republic. This next case occurred on September 22nd, 1972, as I said, in Via Altagracia in the Dominican Republic. This is somewhat near Cuba. This case was investigated by Sebastian Robiou Lamarche. And yeah, a brief case. It involves a local peasant woman who reported seeing 2 short beings get out of a strange device covered with lights, a UFO, and grabbed a goat that seemed to be paralyzed. She watched as these 2 short beings carried the goat into the UFO, which took off at great speed until disappearing from sight. So yeah, a goat kidnapped by ETs. So yeah, that is a brief case, but it fits right in here. So that's why I wanted to include it. And these things are apparently happening. Lots of cases where ETs come down and are certainly interested in or are collecting animals. And here's another one. I call this one, Can We Have 4 of Your Rabbits? This is a really interesting case, probably one of my favorite of this little compilation. And this one occurred in Santiago, Chile, and is really a friendly encounter with human-looking ETs, who, as we shall see, were apparently on an exploratory mission trying to collect animals from Earth. This case occurred on August 17, 1977, into the specific area of Alto Jahuel. This is about 45 kilometers south of Santiago, Chile. The main witness is Marco Antonio de la Cuadra. He's 70 years old, a farmer, and it was around 9 p.m. on August 17, and he was in his home and heard this buzzing sound coming from the far low end of his property. This is where he kept a hutch of rabbits. So he went outside to investigate and walked up to this rabbit hutch and saw a large oval object that he described as being about as big as, quote, a small building. And standing in front of this sort of oval-shaped object was a very tall, human-looking figure with blonde hair, and he was wearing what the witness described as a tight-fitting kind of white diver's suit. Now this man communicated in a way that Marco Antonio felt was difficult to describe, probably telepathically, but this being said that he was looking for animals and that he was part of a scientific exploratory research group that was gathering species of animals. And he said specifically they were looking to collect fish to populate the waters of their planet, which had no more fish, which were basically dead. According to Marco Antonio, this man was very friendly, very cordial. Marco Antonio had no fear, and he told this apparent ET that, sorry, he had no fish, but he did have rabbits. And the entity asked for some rabbits. Now, Marco didn't hesitate. He obliged and brought the man 4 rabbits, 4 ermine rabbits, 2 male and 2 female, in a cage. At this point, the man instructed the witness to put the cage on the ground and then to turn around and not look back until the buzzing sound ended. Now, this is what Marco Antonio did. He set the cage down, turned around, at which point a buzzing sound swept over him, as well as a strong mist and an intense bright light. That all went away very quickly, and afterwards Marco turned around and the cage was empty. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting case. It created quite a bit of attention in Santiago, Chile, and as you can see, the witness did give interviews. It's a really interesting case. As you can see, a truly interesting case. The witness wasn't frightened at all. He told the ETs, no, I don't have any fish, but I do have rabbits to offer you, and they absolutely wanted the rabbits. It's a pretty interesting case. And here is another one, which I call, they were interested in the chickens. I like this case because it has 4 witnesses independent of each other, 2 groups of 2 witnesses. This occurred in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico, and it has a lot of verification in terms of 2 sets of witnesses and physical evidence as well. I also like it because this encounter lasted quite a long time, and it's just really bizarre. This next case occurred on March 3rd, 1980, and it was about 3:30 a.m. when 16-year-old Vivian Cruz Rodriguez was woken up in her home at 148 Interior Calle Canales in Buen Consejo. This is a suburb of Rio Piedras in Puerto Rico. And she woke up because their 2 chihuahuas were barking frantically, and she heard someone on the porch moving stuff around on their outside patio. So Vivian looked out the window and saw 5 short beings, and they were weird looking. She said they had gray skin, large eyes, big pointed ears, what appeared to be webbed hands and feet, though this might be part of what they were wearing, and they were wearing dark brown full-body jumpsuits, which covered pretty much everything except their faces. Now, 2 of these beings were 5 feet tall, and the other 3 were about 3 feet tall. So seeing these beings, Vivian immediately woke up her 12-year-old brother, Jose. And the 2 of them looked out the window and watched these figures moving around the porch as if searching for something. Now, they wanted to wake up their parents, but as it turned out, their parents slept in a room that was across on the other side of the patio, which would have forced Vivian and Jose to basically go outside and cross the patio to get them. So they couldn't wake up their parents, and they just continued to watch. And I'll just quote Vivian directly in her own words, as she says, "We got a good view of the face of one of the little ones when he seemed to perceive that we were watching them, and he looked straight at us. His face was gray and elongated with a pointed chin. His head was pear-shaped, with big eyes and big eyelids, and his eyes were shining as a dog's eyes do in the dark. As regards to the nose and mouth, I didn't get a good idea of them, as my attention was taken up so much by his shining eyes. He was wearing a helmet, as all of them were, and in his case, the helmet had a sort of center crest on the top of it. The hands of all 5 were identical, and so were their feet, all looking like duck's feet. None of the 5 beings were walking. They seemed to move around by little jumps, as though they were floating over the ground." So both Vivian and Jose had the impression that the 2 5-foot-tall beings were ordering the 3 smaller beings around. Now they didn't hear any voices, but the entities seemed to communicate perhaps by telepathy or hand gestures, because they were gesticulating. And Vivian also noticed another weird detail. These beings seemed to be moving in a weird kind of slow motion fashion. So Jose verifies all of this, and as he says in his own words, they certainly seem to be looking for something out there in the patio. They seem to be very interested in the chickens too. Most of the time they kept shaking the pens, and at times they peered closely and fixedly at the chickens. It was something to do with the chickens, that's for sure. One thing that surprised me very much was that although the dogs had been doing a lot of barking, neither the hens nor the goat near the fowls' pens seemed to be the slightest bit affected by what was going on. They were all calm and quiet, even though the beings kept touching and shaking the pens. Now as they watched, and this went on for quite a while, one of the beings showed particular interest in an old discarded car mirror on the patio. And this being actually picked this mirror up and examined it for several minutes before finally putting it down. Vivian said that one of the beings scooped up water from a little tub that the next door neighbor used for his ducks. So this went on for nearly a half an hour, and suddenly all the animals seemed to become sleepy. The little chihuahuas were no longer barking, they returned to bed. Jose himself says he became overwhelmed by this feeling of drowsiness and sleepiness to the point where he just couldn't stay awake. And what's really interesting is later investigators questioned the parents, who said that they had in fact woken up, hearing the barking of the chihuahuas and the commotion on the patio, and they both tried to get up, but felt such a strong wave of drowsiness sweep over them that they were totally unable to get out of bed. So that does seem to be a peculiar physiological effect. Perhaps the ETs were, sort of imposing this on the witnesses. But at this point, a car began to approach, and the beings seemed to become alarmed by it and quickly fled the area, heading towards the nearby road, Avenida 65 Infanteria. In the morning, they did find some physical evidence. They found the silhouette of one of the beings' hands on a piece of zinc sheeting. And where the beings had been standing, they saw damp patches of some strange liquid, though it did evaporate. So they didn't see any UFO. But it turned out that there were other witnesses. Luciano Rivera, age 47, lived nearby at number 433 Calle 21. This is at the Hill Brothers Precinct at Sabana Yan. This is a suburb of the same town, Rio Piedras. Luciano and a friend had gone to a bar that evening. They had a few drinks, and after enjoying the evening, returned home, They insist that at this point they were no longer intoxicated, but they were tired and they were resting in their car in front of their home when Luciano woke up to see a strange object about 36 feet away. He said it was 25 feet wide and about 10 feet thick or high. And I'll just quote Luciano directly, as he says, "It was shaped like a flying saucer and was lit up. It had 3 metallic supports on which it was standing. It had a big metallic cupola with a number of windows emitting a deep orange-colored light. The cupola was silver-colored, like aluminum, and from the top of the cupola, an antenna projected, shooting beams of white light in various directions. The projecting center part of the craft was pale yellow and seemed to be lit up. There was an opening from which a small metallic ladder ran down to the ground. When I saw that, I woke my friend up, and when he saw it, he got very scared. When I started up the car and switched on the lights, we saw 5 strange figures moving slowly on the slope of the nearby piece of property." So this matches so far what the other witnesses reported, at least in terms of there being 5 figures. And Luciano described these beings very much in the same details as the Rodriguez siblings. But Luciano did add that these figures were wearing belts and had what appeared to be little medallions on their chests which were emitting flashes of red and blue light. He got a good look at their faces and did see that they had large nostrils and thick lips, and he had the impression that one of these taller beings was female and the other was male. Now, one of them was carrying a shining metallic sphere in his hand. That's interesting because that does turn up in a lot of these ET cases. But they watched in shock as these 5 beings floated over a chain link fence back to the craft and entered it by climbing the ladder. At this point, the object rose up, the landing legs retracted, and the craft moved off in a wobbling pendulum-like motion. Now, investigator Jorge Martin did investigate this case. He's a very well-known investigator. And he did learn that there were several other witnesses in the nearby town who had seen a UFO on that night in that area. So that's good confirmation. I think you'll agree that was a truly interesting case. Puerto Rico has an awful lot of UFO activity reaching back many decades. So I guess it shouldn't be surprising that there's a case involving ETs interested in chickens, though there's no evidence that they actually took any chickens, despite the title of the article, or one of the articles, saying that these were chicken poaching aliens. There is no mention of missing chickens in the actual report, so take that for what you will, but wow, what a case. And here's another one. This one is quite bizarre. I call it, "I saw a dolphin on a UFO." I like this case because it is unique, though I have to tell you I did once interview a lady who said that she was taken on board and did see dolphins on board a UFO. So perhaps not as unique as you might think. This one took place in Manchester, England, and as we shall see, this witness saw dolphins on board a UFO. So this case occurred in January of 1981, as I said, in Manchester, England, and this was investigated by well-respected researcher Jenny Randalls. We don't know the name of the witness. She's anonymous, but she was returning home with her mother on the highway when suddenly they noticed that there was no traffic. Everything was very strangely quiet, and this is when they noticed this huge light started pacing their car. And they tried to accelerate, but their car would not accelerate, and in fact it slowed down. And things became even more strange because suddenly a very peculiar, quote, old-fashioned car appeared ahead of them very close to their own car. and they became momentarily distracted by this and looked away from the light. And when they looked back at the vehicle, it had transformed itself into what looked like a typical flying saucer, a metallic disc that was hovering above the main road. Or at least that was their impression. There was no old car there now. And they finally reached home feeling quite nauseous, the witness. And she noticed at this point that her coat was missing. And that's when she also noticed that she was missing 2 hours of time. So after researching all of this, she decided to undergo hypnotic regression. And all she was able to remember was being in a large, clean, kind of white room. Inside this room there was a very tall, human-looking man with blonde hair. He was wearing a white sort of jumpsuit. He had blue eyes. And at some point he took her to a large enclosed pool area where she saw an ill dolphin, a sick dolphin. And here's where it's so interesting, because this very tall man with blonde hair and blue eyes asked her to touch the dolphin. So I don't know what the reason for that is. Perhaps this was all about helping to heal the dolphin or something. I'm purely speculating, I don't know. But it's a very interesting case where someone saw a dolphin on board a UFO. There you go. Dolphins on board a UFO. I suspect there's a lot more cases like these, but would you tell anyone if you saw an animal on board a UFO? I don't know. I hope so, but I suspect that a lot of people don't. And here's the final case I'd like to report today. And I call this one Pig Snatching Aliens. And this one is really quite well verified in that the Breeze family all saw activity, most of them at least, as well as neighbors. This does involve physical evidence of various kinds, landing traces, and more, as we shall see. It does have some pretty, I guess you might say, hostile elements. All at the same time, the ETs were saying, do not be afraid, we mean no harm. However, as we shall see, since the witness did attack them, shooting at them, well, the ETs did react. So let's just get to this case, because wow, it is different. This one's a doozy. This occurred on September 12, 2006, not that long ago, in the very small town of Tappan, North Dakota. And this involves the Breeze family. It was early in the morning before sunrise when 16-year-old Evan Breeze got up to get a glass of water, and he saw something moving around in the corral where they keep their pet pigs. And he first thought this might be a coyote, which wouldn't be unusual, so he grabbed a rifle and went into the corral. Now this is, again, before sunrise. The only source of light is the moon, so it's quite dark, and entering the corral, he saw 2 bipedal figures. They were very tall, 8 to 9 feet tall, and they were doing something to one of the hogs. In fact, he saw one of these figures lift up the hog with one arm and basically toss it to the other figure. This scared Evan quite badly. It was a real shock. So he basically acted very quickly and fired his rifle right at one of the creatures, at which point it emitted a loud scream. He felt a strong wave of fear coming from these figures, and he heard a telepathic message from them saying, "We mean you no harm." Now, despite this, these figures did react. One of the creatures floated very quickly towards Evan, and basically, he says, threw him to the ground. Evan landed on his back and blacked out. He woke up a short time later. At this point, he saw that their 450-pound sow, Ruthie, who had been about to give birth, was missing. Also, Evan's shirt was torn up, as you can see. So he ran inside. He called his sister Trisha, who called their parents. Their parents called the police, and together they investigated the scene. And it was just a few days later, ufologist Richard Moss used hypnosis on Evan, who under hypnosis said that he actually saw 5 entities in the corral who were dragging Ruthie from the stall when he surprised them. So this wasn't a one-off. Actually, there was a lot going on at this time to the Breeze family, because it turned out that 5 months earlier, Evan was on the property walking with his dog Buster when he saw a strange light on the ground. This was some distance away. Going up to investigate, he saw that it was in fact a craft on the ground, and it was emitting a beam of light which appeared to be shining on one of their water holes. He and his dog watched it for just a few seconds, stunned, at which point his dog Buster ran up to it, and the craft immediately took off. And it turned out that the boy's father, Tory Breeze, said that in July of that year, he and his neighbors saw a strange blue light in the sky that they couldn't identify. And as he said, we spent a half hour watching it. So there were other events that were occurring at this time. They did find a dead cow, which died under mysterious circumstances, though they can't connect it directly to any of this. Anyway, it was a series of events which spread like wildfire through this very small town and was published in the local newspaper. It was of the buzz of the town for quite a while. It's a pretty well investigated case and certainly very unusual. So there you go. Those are 8 cases, each involving animals with some weird animal stories. There's a lot of these kinds of cases, but these, as we see, come from all over the world, many involving multiple witnesses, reaching back decades, all the way up to very much current times, and all kinds of physical evidence, different types of ETs, each providing some interesting insights into how not only ETs behave, but how we react to them. So there's always new stuff to learn from UFO encounters. It's one of the reasons why I love doing this research. I really want to thank you for watching this unusual episode today. I hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting, and maybe even learned something. But until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep asking questions, and most important, keep having fun.